A widowed woman buys a slave who was already on the gallows, and what he did changed everything in her life. A story of love, faith, and redemption during the period of slavery in the United States. The scorching July sun of 1857 beat down on the public square in Charleston, South Carolina. A crowd gathered around the gallows where 3 men awaited execution. Among them stood a slave of imposing stature, muscles defined by brutal work on the plantations, and eyes that still retained a glint of dignity that slavery had not been able to completely extinguish. His name was Josiah. Convicted for defending a slave girl from being raped by an overseer, his sentence was decided in minutes. For the system, he was an example that needed to be made. A slave who dared to raise his hand against a white man deserved nothing but death. Among the crowd, a female figure stood out for her upright posture and the black mourning dress she had worn for 3 years. Margaret Whitmore, widow of a fabric merchant, watched the scene with a heavy heart. Her blue eyes, marked by the pain of loneliness and an emptiness that money could not fill, fixed on Josiah. There was something about that man, something she couldn't explain. As the executioner began to read the sentences, Margaret felt an impulse that defied all logic. Her late husband, Thomas, had left her a considerable fortune, but also an immense void. Childless, without purpose, she wandered through the large, empty house like a ghost among the living. But at that moment, looking at Josiah, something ignited within her. "Stop!" Her voice cut through the stuffy air. The crowd turned, surprised. Margaret stepped forward, her heart pounding. "I'll buy this slave. How much do you want for him?" The sheriff, a burly man with a grey mustache, laughed disdainfully. "Mrs. Whitmore, this black man is dangerous. He attacked a white man. He's not merchandise for a lady like yourself." "Name your price." The firmness in Margaret's voice surprised even herself. "I have the money and the right to buy it, or have the laws of this state changed?" A tense silence filled the square. The sheriff knew that the widow Whitmore had influence and fortune. After a tense negotiation that lasted 15 interminable minutes, Margaret paid an absurd sum, 3 times the value of an ordinary slave, and Josiah was taken down from the gallows. When their eyes first met, something inexplicable passed between them. Josiah saw kindness where he expected contempt. Margaret saw humanity where society saw only property. Neither of them knew at that moment that this impulsive decision would change both of their lives forever. On the way to the Whitmore estate, inside the silent carriage, Margaret watched Josiah, who sat beside the coachman. Whip marks on his back were visible through his torn shirt. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, the first sincere one in 3 years. "Lord, show me why I did this. Show me what your purpose is." What she didn't know was that Josiah was also praying at that moment, thanking the God his mother had taught him to worship, even in chains. A God he had never abandoned, even when all seemed lost. Whitmore Mansion loomed on the horizon like a sleeping giant. 23 rooms, sprawling gardens, and only one solitary woman to inhabit it. When they arrived, Margaret did something that shocked the 3 servants of the house. She ordered that Josiah be treated, fed, and housed not in the slave quarters at the back of the property, but in the guest room near the main house. "Madam, this is not appropriate," protested Gertrude, the housekeeper. "What will they say?" "Let them say what they want," Margaret replied, surprising herself with her own courage. "This man almost died today. He will have dignity under my roof." That night, as Margaret dined alone at the large mahogany table, she wondered if she had gone mad. She had spent a fortune saving a stranger. But something in her spirit, something she hadn't felt since Thomas's death, whispered that she had done the right thing. In his room, Josiah knelt and wept for the first time in years. "Thank you, Father," he murmured. "Thank you for another day." Neither of them slept that night. Less than 200 meters apart, they both felt their lives had changed forever. but the secrets each carried and the dangers to come were still hidden in the shadows of the future. The first few days were tense and silent. Margaret had arranged for Josiah to work in the gardens and on the upkeep of the property, but something about him deeply intrigued her. The way he treated the plants with almost reverent care, how his eyes lit up as he leafed through a book left in the garden gazebo. Slaves weren't taught to read. It was a crime. But Josiah clearly knew. On the third morning, Margaret found him in the garden before dawn, on his knees, whispering words she immediately recognized. Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." She felt tears burning her eyes. It had been so long since she had truly felt the presence of God. "You know the scriptures," she said softly, making him jump. Josiah stood up quickly, fear flooding his face. Knowledge was dangerous for a slave. "Forgive me, ma'am. My mother taught me this when I was a child, before—" Her voice faltered. "Before we were separated." Margaret felt her heart break. "You don't need to apologize for praying, Josiah. Never. In this house, you are free to seek God." Those simple words broke something inside Josiah. For the first time, he raised his eyes and truly looked at Margaret. He saw in her not a distant white lady, but a lonely and wounded soul like his own. "Do you pray too?" he asked, forgetting for a moment the social barriers. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "I was trying. My husband died 3 years ago. Since then, I feel like God has turned away." "He doesn't turn away, Mum," Josiah said gently. "It's us who sometimes get lost in grief." An unlikely friendship began there. Margaret started allowing Josiah to use the library, first secretly, then openly, defying social conventions. She discovered that he had a brilliant mind, capable of profound discussions about faith, philosophy, and justice. Josiah discovered in Margaret a genuine kindness that he had thought extinct in the world. But the neighbors began to talk. Widow Whitmore was giving too many liberties to the slave she had bought from the gallows. Charles Pemberton, a wealthy farmer who coveted both Margaret's land and her hand in marriage, visited her with a veiled warning. "Margaret, my dear, people are worried," he said, sitting down uninvited in the living room. "A dangerous slave with so much freedom. It's not safe. It's not appropriate." "Josiah is not dangerous, Charles. He is a man of faith and character." Charles laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "He's property, my dear, nothing more. And if you're not careful, you'll have problems. There are rumors that he was convicted of attacking an overseer. Men like that don't change." After Charles left, Margaret sought out Josiah. "Is it true? You attacked a white man?" Josiah was mending the garden fence. He stopped, his hands trembling slightly. "Yes, ma'am. But it wasn't as they say." He took a deep breath. "I saw the overseer dragging a slave girl, Sarah, 15 years old, to the barn. She was screaming, pleading. I couldn't stand by. I pulled him away from her. I didn't seriously hurt him, I just pushed him. But it was enough to be condemned." Margaret felt anger and sadness in equal parts. "You did what was right, not in the eyes of the law, ma'am." Josiah stared at her. "Why did you save me? That day, on the gallows, why?" Margaret remained silent for a long moment. "I can't explain it. It was as if God had placed an urgency in my heart, as if you needed to live, as if I needed you to live." That night, something changed between them. It wasn't just respect or gratitude. It was a deeper connection, dangerous in a society that forbade such feelings. Margaret began to realize that she eagerly anticipated moments with Josiah, conversations about faith, stories he told about his mother and his childhood before slavery destroyed everything. Josiah, for his part, found himself constantly thinking about Margaret, about how she laughed when he told her something funny, about the way her eyes sparkled when they discussed the scriptures. But he reprimanded himself harshly. She was a white, free, rich lady. He was a slave, her property. Those thoughts were impossible, dangerous. But the heart knows no impossibilities. And under the southern moonlight, in the fragrant gardens of Whitmore Manor, something forbidden was beginning to bloom, something that would test them both in ways they could not yet imagine. The secrets each of them kept were about to collide with forces that threatened to destroy not only what they felt for each other, but their very lives. For Margaret hid a past that few knew, and Josiah carried a secret that, if revealed, could kill him. 3 months had passed. Whitmore Manor, once silent as a tomb, now throbbed with life. Margaret found herself singing while arranging flowers, smiling for no apparent reason. Josiah had transformed the gardens into a small paradise, but more than that, he had transformed the heart of the lonely widow. They established a ritual. Every night, after dinner, Margaret and Josiah would sit in the garden gazebo and read the Bible together. It was scandalous, unthinkable, but neither of them could stop. The sacred words seemed to gain new meaning when shared. Mrs. Margaret, Josiah said one night, using the more intimate form of address she had insisted on, "May I ask a personal question?" She looked at him in the soft light of the lanterns. In recent months, she had learned to read the nuances in his face. Always. "Why have you never remarried? A woman like you surely had suitors." Margaret slowly closed the Bible. "I have. I still have. Charles Pemberton proposes to me every 3 months like clockwork." She paused. "But I don't want a marriage of convenience. I don't want someone who sees me as a means to acquire property or status. I want—" She stopped, aware that her next words would cross a dangerous line. "I want someone who sees my soul, someone I can talk to about God, about life, about everything, someone who makes me feel alive again." Josiah held the Bible firmly in his hands. "You deserve this. You deserve to be happy. And you, Josiah, have you ever had anyone?" The words came out before she could stop them, his face contorted in pain. "I did. Hannah, we were married in the eyes of God, though not in the eyes of the law. She was pregnant when—" His voice broke. "When we were sold to different owners. I never saw her again. It's been 12 years. I don't know if she's alive, if my son—" He couldn't continue. Driven by an impulse that defied all social rules, Margaret touched his hand. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry this world is so cruel." Josiah looked at her hand on his, small, pale, soft. He should have pushed it away, but he couldn't. "Mrs. Margaret, He looked up, and in his eyes she saw something that both frightened and moved her. "I shouldn't say this. It's wrong, impossible, but you changed everything for me. You not only saved my life, you saved my soul. You made me believe again that there is goodness in the world." "Josiah," Margaret whispered, her heart racing. But the moment was interrupted by hurried footsteps. Gertrude, the housekeeper, approached, her face pale. "Mrs. Whitmore, there are men at the entrance, the sheriff and Mr. Pemberton. They say they need to speak with you urgently." Margaret quickly withdrew her hand, reality invading the magical moment. When she reached the entrance, she found not only Charles and the sheriff, but 5 other men, all armed. "Margaret," said Charles with feigned concern, "we've received troubling information. It seems your slave has been talking to other slaves in the area about escape, about freedom. They're planning a rebellion." "That's absurd," Margaret replied firmly. "Josiah wouldn't do such a thing." The sheriff stepped forward. "Madam, we have witnesses. Josiah was seen on 3 different properties talking to slaves. Even if there's no rebellion, he's spreading dangerous ideas. I need to interrogate him." Margaret felt the world spin. She looked at Josiah, who remained at a distance. In his eyes, she saw not denial, but resignation. He wasn't surprised, because it was true. "Leave him alone," said Margaret, placing herself between the men and Josiah. "He is under my protection." Charles laughed. "Protection? Margaret, open your eyes. This man is using you. He's using your kindness, your loneliness. He's a manipulator, probably waiting for the right moment to escape, or worse. You bought a criminal off the gallows, and he's proving he's still dangerous." No! Margaret turned to Josiah, tears streaming down her face. Tell them it's not true." Josiah stepped forward, his posture erect and dignified. "I spoke with other slaves, yes. I spoke to them about a God who loves them, about dignity, about hope, about how there are good people in the world like Mrs. Whitmore who see our humanity. I didn't preach rebellion, I preached faith." "Faith?" Charles spat out the word. "A slave who doesn't know his place is dangerous, no matter how beautiful his words may be." The sheriff looked at Margaret. "Madam, I respect you and your late husband, but the law is clear. If there is suspicion of conspiracy, I must investigate. Josiah will come with me for questioning." "No, you're going to kill him." Margaret was desperate. "Please, he did nothing wrong. I beg you." Josiah touched her arm gently. "Mrs. Margaret, it's all right. The truth will prevail. Trust in God." As they led him away, Margaret fell to her knees on the ground, sobbing. At that moment, she realized the terrible truth she had been denying for 3 months. She didn't just admire Josiah or feel grateful to him. She loved him. Deeply, impossibly, desperately loved that man, and now she could lose him forever. Margaret didn't sleep. He spent the entire night on his knees, praying as he hadn't prayed in years. "Lord, I know what I feel is impossible in the eyes of the world, but in your eyes, aren't we all your children? Didn't you create Josiah with the same soul you gave me? Please protect him. Don't let me lose him too." At dawn, she made a decision. She dressed carefully, gathered important documents, and went to the city. Her first stop was the office of the family lawyer, Samuel Garrison, an elderly and respected man. "I need to do something urgently," she said. "I need to free Josiah, legally." Garrison looked at her with surprise and concern. "Margaret, do you know what you're asking? Freeing a slave is complicated, expensive, and given his case, impossible. He was convicted of violence. No judge will approve." "Then find another way." Margaret slammed her hands on the table. "Samuel, you knew my husband. Thomas was a good man who hated slavery, but didn't have the courage to fight against it. I have that courage now. Help me." While Garrison searched through the law books, Margaret went to the jail. What he found there horrified her. Josiah was in a damp, dark cell, his body marked by fresh wounds from the interrogation. But his eyes still shone with that unwavering light. "Mrs. Margaret," he whispered through the bars, "you shouldn't be here. Your reputation—" "I don't care about my reputation." She gripped the bars, her fingers touching his. "Josiah, there's something I need to tell you, something I can no longer keep silent about." "No," he interrupted gently. "Please don't say it, because if you do, it will make everything more difficult, and it's already impossible." "Why impossible?" Tears streamed down her face. "Because you're black and I'm white? Because you're a slave and I'm free? These are the rules of men, Josiah, not of God." "Because I'm married," he said softly, and the words landed like bombs. "Hannah, my wife, I told you about her. I don't know if she's alive, but in God's eyes, I'm still married. And even if I weren't, Mrs. Margaret, the world would destroy us. You for loving me for accepting that love. I can't do that to you." Margaret recoiled as if she'd been hit. "Of course, Hannah. How could she have forgotten? How could she have been so selfish?" "You're right," she whispered. "Forgive me, I'm a fool." "No." Josiah reached through the bars, touching her face. "You are the bravest and kindest person I have ever known. You are my light in the darkness, but some loves weren't meant for this world. They were meant for the next." Margaret left prison heartbroken, but with renewed determination. If she couldn't have Josiah, at least she would save his life. She spent 3 days and a fortune bribing, negotiating, persuading. Finally, she achieved something extraordinary. The judges promised to release Josiah on an impossible condition, that she find Hannah or prove her death. freeing Josiah from marital responsibility in the eyes of society. It was an impossible mission. Hannah could be dead or on any of the hundreds of farms in the south, but Margaret was stubborn. Using her late husband's fortune, she hired private investigators. It took 4 months of exhaustive searching. During this time, Josiah remained imprisoned. Margaret visited him weekly, always maintaining an appropriate distance, always hiding the love she felt. They talked about faith, about hope, about God's plan which they could not understand. "If we find Hannah," Margaret once said, "and she's alive, you'll be freed to go with her to rebuild your life." "And you?" Josiah asked. "What will happen to you?" "I'll be happy," she lied, "knowing that you're free and happy." But then came the day that would change everything. One of the researchers returned with news. He had found Hannah, alive. But what he had discovered was devastating. Margaret went to get the news in person. Hannah was at a farm 3 days' journey away. The investigator had brought a message. Josiah was alive and looking for her. Hannah's reply was clear. "Tell him I've rebuilt my life. I remarried 8 years ago to the man who bought me. We have 3 children. Josiah must move on. I release him from our vows. May he be happy." The child she was carrying when they were separated, he was stillborn. Margaret held the letter with trembling hands. Joy and sorrow mingled in her heart. Josiah was free from his vows, but at what cost? How would she tell him that everything he had loved was gone? When he arrived at the prison, he found Josiah praying. He looked at her and knew, just from the expression on her face, that there was news. "Did you find her?" was not a question. Margaret nodded, handing him the letter. Josiah read slowly, each word a stab at old wounds. When he finished, he remained silent for long minutes. Then, surprisingly, he smiled through his tears. "She's happy. She has a family. God answered my prayers in a way I didn't expect, but even so, she's happy." He looked at Margaret. "And what about the judge?" "With this letter, he will set you free." "You are free, Josiah. Legally free." 3 days later, on a cloudy morning, Josiah left prison. Free. His first words as a free man were a prayer of thanks. His second words were for Margaret, who was waiting outside. "Now what?" he asked. Margaret smiled through her tears. "Now you're alive. You're truly alive." But neither of them knew that the greatest ordeal was yet to come. Josiah was free, but freedom in the South before the Civil War was a relative concept for a black man. He couldn't simply leave. He needed documents, a plan, money. Margaret offered all of that, but Josiah hesitated. "I can't accept anything more from you," he said. "You've done too much already. I need to find my own way." "Whatever path that may take," Margaret replied, trying to hide the pain of the impending separation, "know that you will always have a home here." For 2 weeks, Josiah remained on the property, now not as a slave, but as a guest. The townspeople talked more and more about the widow Whitmore and the freed black man. There was something wrong there, they said, something dangerous. Charles Pemberton, tired of being rejected, decided to act. He called a meeting with the most influential men in the city. "Margaret Whitmore has gone mad," he declared. "She's cohabiting with a black man under her roof. This is not only scandalous, it's dangerous. Who knows what ideas he's putting into her head?" The sheriff, who was present at the meeting, shook his head. "Technically, she's not breaking any laws. Josiah is free. But what about the laws of decency, of morality?" Charles slammed his fist on the table. "If we do nothing, other women might follow their example. Freed slaves living as equals. It's the beginning of chaos." They hatched a cruel plan. If they couldn't accuse Margaret directly, they would go after Josiah. One false accusation, one wrong word, and he could be imprisoned again or killed. Meanwhile, at Whitmore Manor, Margaret and Josiah shared what would be their last night together. He would leave the following morning for the north, where free black people had a better chance at a decent life. "I will miss you," Margaret said, tears in her eyes. "More than I should." Josiah approached her for the first time without the master-slave barrier between them. "Lady Margaret, may I ask you something?" "He can. If we were different people in a different time, a different place. Do you think we could—" He couldn't finish. Margaret touched his face tenderly. "Not just in another time and place, Josiah. I think we were meant to meet. Maybe not to stay together, but to save each other. You taught me to feel again, to have faith again. You taught me that love sees no color, only the heart. And you showed me that there is still goodness in the world, that God hasn't abandoned me." Josiah held her hand. "But what now? How do we move forward carrying this burden?" "We trust that God has a purpose," she whispered, "even when we don't understand it." That night, they stayed in the gazebo until late, talking about everything and nothing, memorizing every moment, every word, knowing that this was goodbye. But at dawn, fate had other plans. A group of armed men, led by Charles, arrived at the property. "Josiah!" Charles shouted. "We know you're there! Come out now!" Margaret ran out onto the balcony. "What does this mean, Charles?" "It has been reported that Josiah stole money from you," Charles said with a cruel smile. "And also that he threatened your life. We are here to arrest him." "That's absurd! I never said such a thing." "But others said," Margaret. "Witnesses claim he behaved in a threatening manner, a freed black man attacking a white woman. The penalty is death." Josiah appeared at the door, his hands raised. "I didn't resist when they took me before. I won't resist now. But know that it's all a lie. Mrs. Whitmore is a woman of God, and I would never harm her." "No!" Margaret rushed to stand between them. "You won't take him. I'll hire the best lawyers. I'll testify. Charles pulled her roughly. "You're part of the problem, Margaret. Giving too many liberties, creating expectations. You need to learn your place just as he needs to learn his." Josiah was arrested again, this time on fabricated charges. Margaret spent every penny, every favor trying to prove his innocence, but the false witnesses were convincing. The jury, composed entirely of white men, had already decided its verdict before the trial even began. On the eve of the trial, Margaret had a divine vision while praying. She saw a way to save Josiah, but it would cost her everything she had. Her name, her reputation, perhaps even her life. She made the bravest decision of her life. On the day of the trial, Margaret entered the courtroom with her head held high. When she was called to testify, she did something that shocked the entire town. "Gentlemen of the jury," she said clearly, "Josiah did not steal from me because everything I own already belongs to him. Last night, I signed documents transferring half of my property to him. How can a man steal what already legally belongs to him?" The courtroom erupted in indignant murmurs. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order. Charles Pemberton turned livid. "This is impossible. She's lying to save him." But Margaret produced the documents, duly signed and registered at the notary's office the night before. She had found a legal loophole. She could transfer property to any free person, including Josiah. "And furthermore," Margaret continued, her voice firm despite her inner trembling, "Josiah didn't threaten me. He proposed marriage, and I accepted." The silence that followed was deafening. Then chaos erupted. People shouted, accused, and threatened. The judge tried to restore order. Charles yelled that it was an abomination. Margaret looked directly at Josiah, whose face showed shock and horror. She knew he would understand it was a lie to save him, but she also knew that this lie had just made her an outcast in society. "Are you saying," the judge said slowly, "that you intend to marry this black man?" "I'm saying that I love him," Margaret replied, with a courage she didn't know she possessed. "And that a God who is love cannot condemn true love, regardless of skin color." The trial was suspended in the uproar. Margaret was escorted out by security guards, while the crowd shouted insults. Josiah was taken back to prison, but the charges against him were now complicated. How do you prosecute a man for stealing from someone who claimed to be his future husband and had already transferred property to him? That night, Margaret received a visit from her lawyer, Garrison. "Margaret, what have you done? Even if they save him, you're ruined. No one in society will speak to you again." "It doesn't matter," she said calmly. "Samuel, do you have children?" "Yes, 3. "And do you love them?" "With all my heart." "So you understand," Margaret smiled sadly. "When you truly love someone, you're willing to sacrifice everything for that person." "Josiah returned my soul. If I lose everything to save him, I will still have gained more than I lost." But the events were far from over. The city was in turmoil. A group of men, incited by Charles, were planning something terrible. If the law couldn't solve Josiah's problem, they would. News of the planned lynching reached Margaret through Gertrude, the housekeeper, who had overheard conversations in town. "Madam, they're going to kill him tonight. They're going to storm the jail and hang him. The sheriff won't stop it." Margaret felt her world crumble, but then a strange peace washed over her. It was the same peace she had felt when she bought Josiah from the gallows months before. The voice of God whispering, "Trust in me." She gathered the few loyal servants she had. "I need help. I won't force you to do anything, but if you're willing to risk everything to do what's right." She explained her desperate plan. At midnight, while the lynch mob gathered in the tavern to gain courage with whiskey, Margaret and her allies arrived at the prison. The night guard, a young man named Thomas Jr., the son of her late husband and a slave whom she secretly supported financially, owed her favors. 5 minutes, he said quietly. "That's all I can give." Margaret ran to Josiah's cell. "Come on, there's no time for explanations." "Mrs. Margaret, no. If you help me escape, you'll be an accomplice. You'll lose everything. I lost everything that mattered when I realized the world is too blind to see the worth of a man like you." She took his hand through the bars. "Josiah, every word you said in court was a lie, except one. I love you. I love your faith, your kindness, your strength. If this world can't accept that, then we don't belong in this world." Thomas Jr. opened the cell. "Run! There are horses waiting in the back." But as they left, they found Charles Pemberton and a dozen men blocking the exit. "I thought you'd try something like that," said Charles with a cruel smile. "Margaret, you've always been stubborn, but that ends now." "In God's name, Charles, let us go," Margaret pleaded. "In the name of God," Charles laughed. "God does not approve of your abomination." "God is love," cried Margaret, "and he condemns those who judge in his name." That's when something extraordinary happened. Thomas Jr. stood beside Margaret. "She's right. You'll have to go through me." Then Gertrude and the other servants joined in. One by one, people whom Margaret had helped over the years, people who had seen her genuine kindness, placed themselves between her and Charles's men. "This is absurd," Charles yelled. "Are you going to ruin yourselves over a crazy woman and a black man?" "Let's stand up for what is right," Thomas Jr. said firmly. "Something my father should have done, but didn't have the courage to. Something I will do in his honor." The tension was palpable. For a moment, it seemed that violence was inevitable. Then a voice rang out from the gathering crowd. "Let them go." It was Reverend Hamilton, the pastor of the town church. He stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "Charles, your men, you speak of God and decency, but you plot murder. Jesus said, 'Love one another as I have loved you.' I see no love in your hearts, only hatred. Reverend, you cannot support this. An interracial marriage is—" "It's between them and God," the Reverend interrupted. "I'm not the one to judge their hearts, and neither should you. How many of you went to church last Sunday and sang about God's love? How many prayed for wisdom? And now you want to commit murder?" Slowly, some men in the mob began to lower their weapons, their consciences seizing. Charles saw his power crumble. "You'll all regret this," he spat, but then stepped back. Margaret and Josiah wasted no time. With the horses and provisions their allies had prepared, they set off into the darkness, leaving behind everything they knew. They traveled for 6 weeks, always at night, hiding during the day. They were aided by the Underground Railroad, the secret network that helped slaves escape to freedom. Finally, they arrived in Philadelphia, where more lenient laws existed. There, in a small registry office with only 2 witnesses, Margaret Whitmore and Josiah were truly married. Not in the eyes of Southern society, but in the eyes of God and their own consciences. The first few years were difficult. Margaret lost all her fortune, all her social standing. They lived in a small house. Josiah worked as a carpenter, Margaret as a seamstress, but they were happy. For the first time in their lives, they were completely, genuinely happy. They had 3 children, Thomas in honor of Margaret's first husband, Faith because their faith sustained them, and Liberty because her existence was a testament to freedom. Years later, when the Civil War finally arrived and slavery was abolished, they returned to the South. The Whitmore estate was in ruins, looted during the war, but Margaret and Josiah rebuilt it, transforming it into an orphanage for children of all colors. Charles Pemberton had lost everything in the war and died bitter and alone. Reverend Hamilton, before he died, visited them and confessed, "You two have taught me more about true Christianity than 50 years of preaching. Thank you for having the courage that I lacked for so long." In their old age, sitting in the same gazebo where they fell in love, Margaret and Josiah reflected on their impossible journey. "Do you regret it?" Josiah asked, holding her hand, both of them now wrinkled with age. "To love you, never," Margaret smiled. "I lost a privileged life, but I gained a real life. You saved me as much as I saved you." "God saved us," Josiah corrected gently. "He orchestrated every step, every trial. Look at what we've built. Look at the lives we've touched." Around them, children of all colors played in the gardens. Some were orphans of slaves, others of soldiers fallen in war. All found home and love on the Whitmore estate. "Do you know what's most incredible?" Margaret said. "From that gallows, from that terrible moment, God created all of this. Redemption, love, family, purpose. He transformed our greatest pain into our greatest blessing." Josiah pulled her close. "And all because a courageous woman decided to see a man where the world saw only a slave. And because a man of faith taught me to see God again, where I only saw emptiness." They lived together for another 15 years, side by side, proving that true love knows no barriers, sees no color, and fears no judgment. When they departed, days apart, the entire city attended their funerals, even those who had condemned them. Because, in the end, their lives spoke louder than all the criticism. The story of Margaret and Josiah has become a legend, passed down from generation to generation. A story about how God can use the most impossible circumstances to create something beautiful. About how love, when genuine and guided by faith, can defy the entire world and win. And on the gate of the orphanage they founded, a plaque remains to this day. Where there is love, there is God. Where there is God, nothing is impossible. Dutton Margaret E. Josiah Whitmore. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Share in the comments. Would you have Margaret's courage? Would you have Josiah's faith? Leave your testimony and continue with us on this journey of stories that inspire, move, and strengthen our faith. May God abundantly bless your life. May this story inspire you to live a courageous love, an unwavering faith, and a life that honors the Lord. See you in the next story. God be with you.